our keynote speaker, the Honorable Donald Rumsfeld. Mr. Rumsfeld is an American politician and businessman who served as the 13th Secretary of Defense under President Gerald Ford and as the 21st Secretary of Defense under President George W. Bush. Following the 9/11 attacks, Mr. Rumsfeld oversaw the U.S.-led military campaign against the Taliban in Afghanistan and the toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Prior to serving as Secretary of Defense in the Ford administration, Mr. Rumsfeld served as a 3-term U.S. Congressman for the state of Illinois. He also served in other prominent governmental roles, including as the United States Permanent Representative to NATO and White House Chief of Staff. In addition to his government roles, Mr. Rumsfeld has worked as CEO of the pharmaceutical corporation Searle Company, CEO of General Instrument, and Chairman of Gilead Sciences. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Princeton University. Please welcome the Honorable Donald Rumsfeld.
Well, greetings. Nice to see you all. Rachel, thank you. Appreciate your kind words. We've got Jim Woolsey sitting in the second row here, who always belongs in the first row. But, I walked in, saw him in the back, and was disappointed because I've always benefited from listening to Jim, and he told me he'd already spoken, so we're going to have lunch, I guess, today or tomorrow. I think that this gathering and the agenda is certainly timing. It's timely and it's important subject matter that we all think about, learn from, and remember. I just came in from several months in Montana and New Mexico. And I say that because that's where my head is. I've been looking at owls and turkey and cattle and deer and moose and what have you. And I come into this city and see all the cars. When a car comes down our road in Montana, we turn to my wife Joyce and say, "Who in the world could that be? Must be Federal Express or something," but because nobody comes out there. I do feel out of touch and even out of date. I've been interested in this subject for a good many decades now. As Rachel said, in the 1960s, 50s, I was in the Navy as a pilot, and in the 60s in Congress, interested in the subject. In the 70s, in the Pentagon, and in the 80s, as President Reagan's Middle East envoy, I had to spend a lot of time in that part of the world where an awful lot of the difficulties and challenges come from now. So it's been a long involvement. Think back into those early years, the terrorist attacks against the West were in the single digits, double digits, and in this century they're in the triple digits. And the trend line is very clear. But before responding to questions, which I'm happy to do in a few minutes, I'd like to just mention 3 or 4 things, make several observations. I'm sure the experts that were just on this panel know them well, and many of you do. It's useful, I think, to remind ourselves that the purpose of terrorism isn't to kill people, it's to terrorize, it's to alter behavior. And I think that we need to, I hear people react in strange ways when they talk about terrorism from time to time, but it's important to remember that a terrorist can attack at any time, in any place, using any technique, and it is not possible to defend at every time of the day or night, in every location, against every conceivable technique. It just isn't. And that suggests that defense, while important, is not an answer. It doesn't solve the problem. It requires offense. It requires going after the problem and not thinking you can defend against it as such. I remember in Beirut, after the Marines were killed at the barracks outside the airport, it was a truck loaded with explosives driving into a barracks, blowing it up and killing large numbers of U.S. Marines and Navy corpsmen. So the next step would be to put revetments around a building and try to defend the buildings that way. And of course, then they started lobbing rocket-propelled grenades over the revetments and attacking high-density locations in downtown Beirut along the Corniche. And the next thing, you look at one of these embassy buildings, and they've got wire mesh draped over the building to bounce the RPGs off so that they wouldn't damage the buildings. And then, of course, the terrorists turned and started hitting soft targets going to and from work in the morning. So it makes the point that we have to understand what it's about and how it works, and that defense alone simply is not an answer. A second point I'd make is that normal deterrents don't work. Big armies and navies and air forces deter and dissuade people from attacking big armies and navies and air forces. It's just cost effective. It isn't worthwhile. So obviously you've got to deal with asymmetrical attacks, and the existence of an army and then big army, navy, and air force is important, and it does protect you and deter others from thinking they can, on the cheap, be able to deal with you and impose their will on you. But the threat then becomes an asymmetrical threat, and that is obviously what the world is experiencing. Deterrents also are different in the sense that if we're dealing with people who don't mind dying, if your enemy, if the opposition is the thing you're trying to defend against, is interested in staying alive or protecting real estate, then their behavior is fairly predictable. To the extent they're not defending real estate, and to the extent they're not interested necessarily in staying alive, or might even see an incentive in not staying alive, then you've got a quite different problem. Next, we have to admit that we live in a world where the lethality of weapons is increasing. They are increasingly lethal, and they're increasingly available. And the technologies that are developed in developed countries are largely developed in countries that are free countries. And therefore, the technologies that are being developed and the weapons of increasing lethality are increasingly available to others in the world who don't live or aren't involved in developing those technologies, but they can benefit from them because largely they're off the shelf. The next point I would make is the change since the 1970s or 80s, even 90s, in social media has been enormous, and it unquestionably has an effect that is very much to our disadvantage. The ability to organize and recruit and fundraise is totally different today than it was in the earlier decades of my life. And that has an advantage for the so-called defender, but it has a even greater advantage, I would submit, for the attacker, for those who would use terrorism to attempt to impose their will. And we have to recognize that a significant disadvantage I'd make another comment, and I hate to, I know all of you are interested in this subject. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. You're knowledgeable. As I said at the outset, I feel I'm at 84 years old, out of date, and having been in Montana and New Mexico for the last several months, not even current, let alone not in date. But words matter. And I listen to the television from time to time where they're talking about, for example, the recent attacks. And they get all tangled up in their britches trying to decide if it's a lone wolf or if it's directly connected with something. And then you hear these people opining that it was a cowardly act. Well, I don't think it is cowardly. It seems to me, if you want to find the right words, saying someone's cowardly, for example, we just experienced the anniversary of September 11th, 2001, and they called those people flying those aircraft into World Trade Center as cowardly act. It isn't cowardly. Zealot, yes. Fanatic, yes. But not cowardly. And then you hear things like workplace violence when somebody engages in a terrorist act, and these kind of mindless debates and discussions we're hearing even today on television, which I find misleading because words do make a difference. And calling something workplace violence when that isn't what it is misleading, and being unwilling to properly identify an enemy and put a label on it and recognize that that we're in a conflict, a struggle that is not like a normal war. It's more like the Cold War than a hot war. It is something that takes a great deal of time, and we have to be patient and have to be willing to consider the nature of the threat, and be willing to attack it and deal with it and recognize it as a war, and a war that has to be won, and that the only way to do that is to call it what it is. When I see people unwilling to tell the truth, unwilling to call the problem that we're facing a struggle within that faith between a large number against a relatively small number proportionally, but large numerically, who are determined to pervert the faith and engage in an attempt to impose their will, not simply on the people in their own faith, but on people of all faiths in all parts of the world, and try to impose a caliphate. And to pretend it's anything other than that is to miss the point and to lose the struggle. I think that people talk about, well, what is the threat really? And it seems to me that if I'm right, that it is something more akin to the Cold War than a hot war. And if that's true, it's going to require the marshaling of all elements of national power and of many countries. And it will require patience and persistence. And it will require that we find ways to reduce the resources that go to those activities. We have to find ways to reduce the recruiting successes that exist. We've got to find ways to reduce the safe havens and ungoverned areas and areas where groups of fanatics and Islamists and would-be terrorists can organize and train and equip and launch their attacks on people who don't believe what the terrorists want them to believe. People talk about, well, what are the gravest threats in the world at any given time? And the list is long. I'm sure there were experts up here who've talked about cyber warfare, and we've talked about what the energetic activities of the People's Republic of China and the South China Sea, and we've talked about the problem of terrorism, and we can talk about what Mr. Putin's doing in the Crimea, and so many things that could be listed. But what doesn't get listed, it seems to me, and might very well even be the gravest threat that faces free people, certainly people in the West and people in our country, might be not the thing we say on television, not the thing we have debates and discussions about, not the things that panels talk about, but the things that aren't seen. We know what the People's Republic of China is doing in the South China Sea. What we don't see is what the inaction with respect to that, the leadership vacuum that exists in the world, that it's getting filled by people who don't share our values or share our interests. And therefore, what we don't see is some Philippine parliamentarian who gets up in the morning, looks around the world, sees what they're doing, putting a harbor, an airstrip, moving missiles in to what was a few years ago nothing but a reef. And a vote comes up in the Philippine parliament, and he has a choice. He can see the future with the PRC, or he can see the future with the West, with Japan, Republic of Korea, the United States, Australia, Singapore. But because he sees a vacuum of leadership, he might vote for the future, and he might see the future as the People's Republic of China. Or imagine a policeman's spouse in Baltimore, and another policeman gets killed here, another policeman gets killed there, goes down to breakfast some morning and says to the policeman, "Gee, dear, don't you think this is about enough of this? You've been doing this for 12 or 15 years. You're not getting any support from the local government. You're not getting any support from the people. We've now had 6 or 8 more policemen killed. Why don't we leave Baltimore, move to Phoenix, and go into corporate security or something?" El-Sisi gets up and gives a speech and talks in the most important Arab city in Cairo, in the most important Arab country, Egypt. And knowing his predecessor, Sadat, was killed by the Muslim Brotherhood offshoot, he gets up and gives a speech and says to the important group of imams, and he says, "Look, this isn't right. This isn't what our faith suggests ought to be done. This is different. This is wrong. We have to fight this. We have to deal with it." What does he do? He sticks a target on his forehead, asking to be shot or killed. Fortunately, that's not happened thus far. But where did he get support? Nowhere. It wasn't printed in the United States in the press. You didn't see our political leaders stand up and praise the speech as someone of that faith who does not believe that direction is the right direction for that faith, but is opposed to it and is willing to say so and is willing to put his life at risk for it. Well, we hold back on parts for military equipment for him because he's not our style Democrat. Doesn't behave in a manner that is acceptable to our government. So we don't help him. We not only don't help him, we don't even support the words that he spoke. So I guess what I'm saying may be that the gravest threat is not what President Obama said to the Coast Guard Academy's graduation speech this year, that it's global warming. It may be that the biggest threat is not even Iran and the unfortunate arrangements that just have been made with that country, the leading supporter of terrorism on the face of the earth. It may not even be Mr. Putin or the PRC. It may be that the weight and power of the millions of actions that we don't see reported on television all across the globe have a weight and a power that are greater than any one of these lists of 10 or 12 or 14 things one could mention as a grave threat. And I say that because they aren't being reported in the press. What the spouse of the policeman in Baltimore, the parliamentarian in the Philippines, the people down in Venezuela trying to get bread from passing cars or trucks. The gravest threat may very well be the fact that there is a leadership vacuum in the world, and the vacuum's being filled by people who don't have our interests, our values, and that is a problem that is notably unreported, undiscussed, and often the biggest problem is the one that we don't give a value to, give a weight to, give our primary attention to. With that, I'll stop and be happy to respond to some questions.
Mr. Secretary, good to hear from you this morning.
Someone needs to show me who. Oh, here you are. Yeah, if you stood up, that'd be a help. I can.
Just talking about
That guy's big in front of you. I didn't even know you were there.
hiding behind. Good morning. Talking about the leadership vacuum and following Ambassador Woolsey, how did it happen that we got into this situation, that a Wendy Sherman, a social worker, and then a political activist lands up negotiating the first North Korean nuclear agreement and then the Iran agreement? How does it happen that a Ben Rhodes, undergraduate student of literature, lands up selling the Iran deal, when we have thousands of bipartisan experts, generals, and PhDs in Washington, D.C.? And lastly, the Muslim Brotherhood, is it more in the State Department or in the White House or both?
Well, as a broken down ex-politician, I've got a short answer for you, and it's a harsh one. If we want to know where the problem is, all we have to do is look in the mirror. Thank you very much. I think it was Churchill who said that democracy is the worst form of government except for any other that's ever been tried, and I guess the answer is it is the best, but it's not perfect. And it's only really good if we pay attention. We have to pay attention. Governance makes a difference. Who leads or doesn't lead makes a difference. And it's true at multiple levels of our society. And how does that happen? It happens because we weren't attentive enough or as skillful in communicating the interests that we have and we share and the interests of the American people and the importance of the United States in how the world works and how it's functioned in the past. And that it doesn't get better by inattention, and that we're not the fault that is causing difficulties and challenges in the world. Human beings are. So I think the answer, unfortunately, is the problem is each of us. It's our priorities or lack of good priorities. It's our attentiveness or lack of attentiveness. It's our engagement or involvement or lack of engagement or involvement. And it can't be underestimated in its importance. Does that make any sense to you? Sure, but there always have been bad people wanting to do bad things to other people across the face of the earth. We know that. Sure, the Muslim Brotherhood is there are those who would say, well, a jihadist, that's bad, and a non-political, if you will, Muslim is good, but the Muslim Brotherhood is kind of the middle in the marrying. It's the political side of that faith. That's baloney. Those folks have a purpose, and it is not a purpose that's benign. It's not a purpose that is in the interests of that faith. It is a collection of people that pretend they're bridging between moderates and jihadists, but in my view, their goal is to see that that element of that faith predominates and prevails. And they may do it with non-jihadi activities, political activities, but that element is a danger to the faith, it's a danger to the Muslim people, it's a danger to non-Muslims, and it's a danger to the world. Sometimes I understate for emphasis. Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, Jim Kay and I had the honor of serving as U.S. Ambassador in Denmark during your final days, and we went to the Mohammed Cartoon
I haven't hit my
crisis.
final days yet.
Final days. We need you back in Washington, by the way. We're here at this conference, though, because in March we lost our son-in-law in the Brussels airport terrorist attack. Our daughter
boy.
Cameron lost her husband and her sister-in-law. And in that case, we know that that was an instance of failed intelligence, failure to act, because we know that the Brussels state knew who these guys were, and they failed to act in time. And there may be a day of reckoning for that. But you know, here in America, we have a mayor and governor in New York who refused to acknowledge that these acts yesterday were terrorist-related. We have a candidate for president who doesn't use the word Islamic terrorism. We have a president who turns a blind eye and claims that we've won that war. Not to get too political, but look ahead, and how hopeful are you that come next year, whether it's a President Clinton or a President Trump, that America will get serious about this threat that we face and that we in this room know we currently aren't battling adequately? How hopeful are you for the America to come?
Well, I think about those attacks where you and your families and your associates there have suffered serious losses, and there's so many people who still think that this is new. Now, the people of Israel know it's not new, but and as I say, I've been involved in the subject matter since the 80s, and it is disturbing that it appears that people are in denial. It is disturbing that we seem to have to be relearning lessons we should have learned and understood well previously. But you ask, I'm from the Midwest, and I guess I'm basically almost genetically optimistic. I'm a person who is hopeful, and I worry about it's easy to worry about the people who are highly visible. But we are the ones that made them. We are the ones, the people of this country are the ones that elect and support or oppose. And it is an amazing system, but it's worked pretty darn well. But we're in an unusual situation. I mean, with the changes in social media, with the changes in the lethality of weapons, with the silliness that we're hearing in terms of the use of words. I mean, one of the leading people in public life today said that the Muslim Brotherhood was not a terrorist organization, that they were, I forget the word that was used, and I don't want to use the wrong word, but there was a word they used that you came away thinking, well, they're benign, and they're not. They're active, they're energetic, they're well-funded, and people are sending them money. But I'll come back to home base for me, and it's leadership, it's governance. I mean, this sounds ridiculous, but I think about, I saw some television out in Montana on Venezuela. When I was running a pharmaceutical company, we had businesses in Venezuela, and they were led by terrific people, solid citizens. And they had money from oil, they had capability, they had talent, and the country was doing not badly. And you look at it now, and people, there are riots. They're stopping people in the street and trying to get bread to eat. And how does that happen? How does it go from pretty darn good to terrible? Disorder, a lack of civility, lack of security. And the short answer is it happens because the people were not as attentive as they had to be, and they allowed bad folks to get in the leadership positions. And we cannot afford to do that. We simply can't. Public life is not a piece of cake. It's hard. And when you see someone in public life that you agree with, you ought to let them know it. And you ought to write a letter to the editor. If you see someone who's saying something stupid and dumb, you ought to let them know it. You ought to write a letter to the editor. You ought to get up and tell your neighbors and friends. And maybe we all ought to have to shift our priorities a little bit and say, well, by golly, this isn't on a driverless Uber car, this country of ours. Is there such a thing? Is it? Not yet, but soon, I guess. We have to hand our hand on the wheel as citizens, as individuals. Who's got the mics that are passing?
I do.
Well, Rachel, is that Rachel? Still? Good. You put your hand up and tell me to not call on people because you're going to do it. All right.
Secretary, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us, and thank you for your service. You've obviously seen a lot of things in your days, and I wondered, as I observed the United States and its arrangement with Iran and the release of assets and American hostages, whether your observation at this conference that highlights Israel's interest in terror and the United States' interest in terror, whether the Israeli policy of concession and specifically land concession as a matter of placating Palestinian terror, whether it's reviving in American policies of concession and kidnapping and other forms of terror, whether you think that this should be considered in terms of Israel's political horizon going forward, or about whether, if Israel definitively wants to finish its experiences with terror, whether the dialogue of territorial concession should be influenced by the disasters of Oslo and the terror that has followed, and also what we've experienced in this country in dealing with Iran.
Wow. I tell you, I really wasn't kidding. When I chaired the Ballistic Missile Threat Commission and the Space Commissions, we used to bring all the formers in, the former this, the former that, the former whatchamacallit, the former secretary of this, and they'd come in. One day I went home and told my wife, you know, Joyce, those folks are smart and they're experienced, but they're out of date and they don't know it. So the other day, someone said to me something about Carleton College. And I said to Joyce, I said to the person, that's a good school. And Joyce said, Don, you don't know anything about Carleton College for the last 50 years. And I worry about responding because there are constant negotiations going on between folks around the world. I've got a lot of respect for the Israeli leadership. They live in a tough neighborhood, they know it, and they behave accordingly, and I respect that. I noticed that Shimon Peres is in the hospital, and I think they said this morning in stable condition. One night I was having dinner with him and my daughter in a Chinese restaurant in Tel Aviv, and he said, you know, Don, he said, if a problem has no solution, it's not a problem to be solved, it's a fact to be coped with over time. And when you think about the differences of view in that part of the world, and the fact that they have been coping with some facts over a sustained period of time, I don't think it's an accident, and I don't think it's not because somebody's come and grabbed them and by the scuff of the neck and said, this is how you solve all that. With respect to Iran, in direct answer to your question, it is the leading supporter of terrorism in the world. And doing things that legitimatize them and provide them any kind of assistance, financial or otherwise, or even political assistance, is a real roll of the dice. And it would have to be something that was clearly, unambiguously advantageous to the West. And it's hard to see anything approximating that in the latest arrangement with Iran that the United States engaged in. My biggest disappointment with Iran was when, oh gosh, it's been some years now, when there was opposition being generated, and we were inactive, inattentive, unsupportive. Does that walk around your questions sufficiently?
Mr. Rumsfeld,
Yes.
many people in this room, I suspect, think you are a very great man.
I wish my wife were here to hear that.
But equally, will remember how you were pilloried and hounded from office. And I wonder if the greatest threat we face today is not the liberal media. If you're allowed to, if your wife will allow you to, would you care to comment on that?
Well, I think that over time, people and institutions tend to become known, understood, and get what they deserve. And the media's conduct is earning them a reputation as being not straight down the middle and not purely informative, indeed quite the contrary. So I think that once that gets known, you know, if you live in a big world like we do and you see a variety of different things, it's hard to know what's true, what's correct. If you live in a small town and Joe lies to you, when Joe comes around the corner the next time, you'd say to yourself, well, here comes Joe the liar. It's no surprise, we know he lied. And yet, in our society, we hear so many things. Someone the other day said something to me, and he said, well, I saw it on the internet. My Lord. We simply have to recognize that we're living in a world where there's a glut of information, an enormous amount of it's not correct, not accurate. No, I don't agree that the liberal media is the biggest threat, because I think at some point we're still in a small enough circumstance that when they come around the corner, we says, well, there comes the guy in the media who's a liar. It's like Joe in a small town, and pretty soon their credibility is diminished. But we lead in this country by consent, not command. And that means that you have to be believable. You've got to be persuasive. And if you lose that credibility, if you lose the reputation for not being straight, you can't lead. You can't get people to be persuaded, because they're simply not going to believe that what you say. They're going to say, here comes lying Joe. And it seems to me the media has kind of boxed them, a lot of the media have kind of boxed themselves into a corner over a period of time. And it's unfortunate, but there's a correction for it, and that's us. We have this amazing system where we can get off our chairs, turn off the television, go out and engage and get involved and make a difference. Rachel.
We don't have time for any more questions. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Mr. Rumsfeld. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. I just got the hook from Rachel.
I didn't want to do it, trust me. All right, everyone. Thank you again so much, Mr. Rumsfeld. We're going to take a break now. As everyone knows, we're running a little bit late today, so we're going to start up at 12 o'clock sharp. Please be back in your seats a few minutes before 12. Don't forget to sign in for your CLE credit today.